Welcome to the Christian Atheist, episode number 28, Thoughts on Hegel, Bad Hegel. As I attempt to present my view of Hegel as the origin of where we went wrong in this episode of the Christian Atheist, I would like to emphasize that there is something necessarily arbitrary in the choice of Hegel as this point of origin. In the Western philosophical tradition, there is very little, if anything, that is really novel in the historical progression of thought. Most of Hegel, his fundamental axioms, can be found in ancient Greek philosophy. Idealism has a long history back to Plato, and process metaphysics predates Socrates. Heraclitus, for example, was a sort of proto-Hegel. Although I view myself as an opponent of Hegel, there is, as I've said, a great deal to admire. A great deal that is right in Hegel and in his followers, even those with whom I most violently disagree. In the course of this series of Christian Atheist episodes, I have learned a great deal about myself and the topics under consideration. I've had a number of intelligent critical responses from many of you, and they've been enormously helpful and useful in refining my own positions, even in correcting them. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for challenging me. As I have said, my central concern in life is truth, and I desire desperately to get it right, even at the cost of discarding my own long-held and cherished beliefs. Philosophy is best done as dialogue, and if my dialogue is only with myself, it's not nearly as rich and rewarding as when I share it with you. Nevertheless, I still view Hegel as my primary philosophical opponent. As a Christian and a fan of Aristotle's ethics, I see life as a balancing act, an attempt to walk in the way that is truth. And as a human being, this is usually found most clearly in the center, not at the extremes. My critiques of Hegel, then, should be understood in light of this commitment. Hegel, I believe, set up the world for a radical extremism from which we have been unable to recover, even though he was not himself, in most ways, an extremist. To begin, then, Hegel's first bad move was perhaps the one that is responsible for most of the resulting damage of his legacy. Something I've praised him for, his dialectical logic. The problem, however, is not the existence of this powerful tool, but in its replacement of Aristotelian logic. Quoting Hegel, "It has indeed been recognized that the forms and rules of the older logic," and by this Hegel means Aristotelian logic, "of definition, classification, and inference, which include the rules of the understanding's cognition, are inadequate for speculative science." This is from Hegel's Philosophy of Right. As I have expressed before, Aristotelian logic, with its cornerstone of non-contradiction, is the logic of being, and served as the rational order of thought since ancient times. In order to salvage the Enlightenment project of absolute knowledge through reason, forbidden by Kant, Hegel invents, adopts, refines a logic which actively embraces contradiction. The logic of becoming, of process. In this way, reason can comprehend all of being. The costs of sowing this wind are, I think, staggeringly high, and the whirlwind we reap today is in no small part the consequence of it. From my perspective, if we properly subordinate becoming to being, Hegelian logic to Aristotelian, and retain the law of non-contradiction, but allow for the contextualized use of Hegel's dialectical logic, then logic itself becomes a more powerful and comprehensive explanatory tool. This requires, however, a separation between how we think and that about which we think, as Kant demands. If being is the asymptotic target of understanding, if reason encounters being but cannot grasp it, totalize it, dissolve it, if reason finds its limit in being, then we can learn about being. We can trace its contours and our own interactions with it. That is, we can study both being and becoming if we give primacy to being, to the great I am. If, by contrast, we abandon being in favor of becoming, as Hegel did, we become lost in subjectivity, in relativity. We abandon sense and ultimately even communication and meaning. This, of course, is the great consequential error of Hegel's logic, in my estimation. Abandoning being in favor of becoming. In Hegel himself, this error is veiled, as Hegel's absolute stands in for this sort of centralization or hierarchical apex discoverable in transcendent being. It is this retention of an absolute in Hegel that explains his conservatism in relation to ethics and social structure, as we pointed out last week. But it also lays the foundation for the abandonment of those in those who follow him. Plato's idealism identifies being and value. That which is most real is also most valuable in Plato. The highest value is the good itself, which Christians call God, the great I am. Lacking the foundation of a transcendent being, in Hegel's process metaphysics, value becomes irretrievably instrumentalized and relativized. For Hegel, reason is good, absolutely good. But reason itself is ever ascending, always becoming, and its self-actualization is its own highest good. All that contributes to reason's ascent is, therefore, good as a means to that ascent. Ethics, on such a view, becomes thoroughly consequentialist. Actions are good only insofar as they produce good consequences. Actions in an existence without an order of being can have no inherent value, only instrumental value in achieving the end. So long as we agree with Hegel on the value of reason, we retain an objective sense of value relative to reason, but we can also begin to see how, as the value of reason itself becomes suspect, that a radical relativity of value becomes possible. In Hegel, then, we find the foundation for the ever-present contemporary and postmodern ethic of the end justifying the means. Quoting again from Hegel, "A world historical individual is devoted to the one aim, regardless of all else. It is even possible that such men may treat other great, even sacred interests inconsiderately. But so mighty a form must trample down many an innocent flower, crush to pieces many an object in its path. This may be called the cunning of reason, that it sets the passions to work for itself, while that which develops its existence through such impulsion pays the penalty and suffers loss. For it is phenomenal being that is so treated, and of this part is of no value. Part is positive and real. The particular is, for the most part, of too trifling value as compared with the general. Individuals are sacrificed and abandoned. The idea pays the penalty of determinate existence and of corruptibility, not from itself, but from the passions of individuals. We might tolerate the idea that individuals, their desires, and the gratification of them are thus sacrificed. And that as a general rule, individuals come under the category of means to an ulterior end, from the philosophy of history. It was against such a poisonous ethical outlook that Kant directed his categorical imperative. Likewise, we begin the slippery slope to an irremediable relativism as soon as Hegel's absolute, the center that cannot hold, as Derrida will have it, loses its position. When there is no highest value as the end towards which lesser values serve as means, any objective sense of value is destroyed. Value is dissolved in an extreme relativism. This relativism of value was precisely what Kant sought to avoid in the deterministic materialism emerging from Enlightenment science, and that the absolute in Hegel's absolute idealism preserves. Kantian ethics holds on to the ought of traditional ethics, that actions can be right or wrong in themselves, in isolation from their consequences. He does this through faith in a metaphysical, objective moral order. For Kant, a lie is a deformation of being itself. It is a violation of the moral order of the universe. This ought, as a demand of being, is the very structure of ethics itself, I contend. The ethical appeal of consequentialist theories, you ought to do X in order to produce Y, is a derivative demand, piggybacking on the primacy of the ought of being. There is no moral force to the hypothetical imperative. If you want Y, a good result, then do X. It is, rather, a practical demand, not a moral one. Consequentialism's ethical pronouncements, properly translated, declare, you ought to want Y, therefore do X. Why, though, ought we to want Y? The only answer that preserves ethical import is the pre-existent ought. Ethics as a constituent of being. I see in Hegel, therefore, the seeds of the destruction of ethics itself. What Hegel does is to substitute an immanent absolute for the transcendent absolute, God. This is Hegel's step into pantheism. In doing so, he places value within the system. So long as the value comes from outside the system, we can retain the ought of traditional ethics. When value is not independent of the system, however, it becomes arbitrary at the grand scale, as there is no way to determine which intra-system value takes precedence over another. Such judgments can only issue from within the system, as there is no outside. So long as Hegel's absolute is accepted as the highest value, therefore, all other values are subservient to it, serve it. Why, however, the question must arise from within such a system, why should any one of the subservient values not be the supreme value that all others should serve? Since all value is reduced to instrumentality except that absolute value, skepticism will eventually face us with a field of open competition between values. Why should rationality, spirit, have pride of place? With no transcendent ought, no objective order of value, we have no way of deciding between such competing claims other than power, a favorite claim of the modern left. Fascism and Marxism represent the earliest permutations of this malleability of the supreme value. Marx substitutes the socialist utopia, and the fascists the state or nation, as the end for which all other values are instrumental, replacing reason. When Nietzsche decried the death of God, he saw what would come. The practical logic of the position was clear from the beginning. When value is relativized and transcendence denied, as Dostoevsky made clear, all things are permitted. Another, more benign way to say this same thing is that ethics has no fixed form. Finally, as is clear from the quotation from Philosophy of History above, what matters most in the progress of spirit are collective structures, and not the particular, the individual. The radical emphasis on group over individual is part of the package of poison fed us so disastrously by Hegel. Freedom, for Hegel, is freedom of spirit, of the absolute, of the collective. As such, individual freedom is phenomenal rather than actual. It is groups that collide, and individuals are not only less important, but are even expendable, if useful as means. Thus, in Marx, we have the conflict of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, reflective of the master-slave dialectic in Hegel. Oppressor and oppressed finds its origins in this same Hegelian dialectic, but its flowering as a primary, perhaps the primary determinant of human relations we find most clearly in the prescriptive Hegelians of the 20th century. The same group emphasis and antagonisms are evident in National Socialism's racial superiority. And in later developments in contemporary society, we have the rise of identity politics. Collective emphasis and analysis tends toward painting individuals as determined by their group affiliation. This is why many today can say with straight faces that they are against racism and that all white people are necessarily racist. Please do not mistake me here. I believe that man is a social animal, that groups matter, and that the collective level of analysis is useful and necessary to a proper understanding of human existence. What I object to is the reduction of the individual to a cog in the machine, an expendable product of group affiliation, a mere moment in the progress of forces over which they are powerless to resist. I object to the notion, as did Jean-Paul Sartre, that any person can be determined by any role or group to which they belong. Individuals always escape any mold into which we try to pour them. Kant fought against the scientific determinism of the Enlightenment. Hegelian determinism is no less pernicious, but has become far more pervasive as a factor in social policy and social attitudes. I believe that individuals are responsible, not groups. I believe that collectivism distorts and excuses human misconduct by shifting responsibility away from its proper locus in being. Our story, of course, is far more complex than my simple complaints here. I am hoping to complete this series on Hegel in our next episode of the Christian Atheists with those philosophers that I have designated as the prescriptive Hegelians. As always, your comments and critiques are welcome and encouraged. If this is the first episode of the Christian Atheist you have encountered, please subscribe below to make sure you don't miss upcoming episodes and to catch up on previous episodes. For first, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And let us know what you'd like to hear from us by commenting. Wise Words for Your Occasion is located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but we're willing to travel. For inquiries or to book an occasion, go to wisewordsforyouroccasion.wordpress.com or see us on Facebook or check out our YouTube channel. You'll find links to all three in this post.